Okay, well, Rose, I think you're going to get us started and then I'll take over.
Yeah, sounds great. Good evening, Council Rock parents. We are so excited to have you tonight join us for a little talk session with Laura Axtell, who is with Reading Horizons. We're going to talk tonight about building better readers. And um, Laura is from Reading Horizons, and we're using Reading Horizons in our literacy skills courses. So we thought it would be great to create some conversation between parents and Reading Horizons Elevate. So I will turn it over to you, Laura.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm very excited. I'm always excited to talk to teachers, but I'm equally excited to talk to parents because I think that's when we get the most or the best outcomes for students when we're all communicating and collaborating together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what Council Rock is doing, but in a bigger, broader sense, what we know more now about the science of reading. So I'm going to start talking about that first. What do we know about the science of reading and why some students have more difficulty than others? And then we're going to talk about the Reading Horizons method, what students who are needing additional support will be doing in their classes with some examples. And then really talking about building better readers. And that extends all the way into comprehension and how does that connect to grade level text and things like that. So for anybody who's joining us, we're going to do some activities. So if you have a scratch paper and something to write with, we're actually going to use that. So I think it's really helpful to start with something that most of us don't know, and that's about our own language. Often people will say English is a crazy language or English is such a confusing language, and it can seem like that. But really, it's 80% of English is patterned and predictable, which means we have very specific patterns that extend all the way into the most complex types of words in English. So 4/5 or 80% of our words are patterned and predictable, but not all of them. So what we know is that about 20% of our words, or 1/5 of all of our words, actually were adopted or borrowed from other languages. And those languages are typically Latin, Greek, French, German, and Old English. So there's been an evolution when words came into English, but the way that it was spoken, like Anglo-Saxon, kind of back in the day. So there's a lot to know about words as it relates to their word origin, like where they came from. So students and parents, frankly, are often, teachers are often really confused when words don't follow a pattern. Why does a word sound like buffet when it's spelled the way it's spelled? Why do we have a PH for the sound of F in photo or phone? Things like that. It's helpful to know that's because those words came from other languages. So the spelling patterns often don't match the pronunciation of that word. Those words have to be encountered and pronounced and discussed separately than the vast majority of the words students have to decode, but they come up all the time. So that's helpful to know. That's the first reason why English can seem very confusing, but also why some students get frustrated when they come to words like that, because it's like, why doesn't this work? So now we're going to talk about those, the 80% that we do know about. But before we can do that, we have to talk about what we know from the science. And there is a lot of science now about what's happening in the brain and what's happening in the brain when it's reading. That's very useful and can be utilized by teachers and administrators in the classroom to support students. So the first thing to know, which many of us didn't know, is that the brain is naturally wired for speech. So if a baby can hear, they will learn to speak whatever language they're surrounded by. And that just happens naturally. And we used to think that reading happened that way too. That if you gave students books and in kindergarten you talked a little bit about sounds and letters, then over time they would just naturally learn how to read. And what we now know is that is not true at all. So we use one set of areas of the brain for speech, but when we add on print, that is an entirely different thing. So you can see all those little boxes and connections that have to be made for print. So reading isn't a natural activity for the brain. And we have to literally build pathways in the brain for print. And for some students, that means that they don't naturally have those pathways in the brain, so we have to build them. And the only way to really build them effectively, especially when students are really struggling, is by targeted instruction. So that's where Reading Horizons really comes in, supporting that brain activity by doing specific things connected to what they're doing in their regular classes. So the other thing that it's very important for students and parents to understand is there is no connection between how well you read and your IQ. So most students that struggle with reading or have reading difficulties have average or above average IQs. In fact, sometimes I'll tell students, you could be the smartest student in the class and still struggle with reading. And that's just because of the way the brain treats text reading. So that's really important for students to know, because sometimes students who struggle think that they're not very smart or they're not as smart as their peers, and that is definitely not the case. So really helpful for students to know that. When we're talking about building better readers, really what we mean is students who can easily read and comprehend what they're reading. So you go into a science class and you can not only read the text or read the assessment, but you understand what you're reading and you can apply what you're reading. And there's a lot of complexity, particularly as students get to those higher and higher grades, because the words are so much more complex, right? So if we break that reading to gain meaning or comprehension down, it's really two things that students need specifically to be able to comprehend. One is you have to be able to decode the word. And we call it decoding because written languages are codes. English is a code, Arabic is a code, Spanish is a code, etc. It's just a way of putting something in writing that allows people to connect to what we would normally say. So it's connecting speech to print, right? So we call it decoding when you're breaking down the code so that you can read it. We call it encoding when you're spelling it, and that's a much harder skill yet. So some students struggle some with reading, but they might really struggle with spelling and writing. So that decoding and encoding of text, of those spelling patterns, is very important. That's the first part. The second part is language comprehension, though. You have to know what the word means. So maybe I can figure out what the word is, but I don't know what the word means. Well, if you don't know what the word means, you're not going to be able to understand what you're reading. So you can see that that's got a multiplication sign there. So if either of those two components are less than one, if we're not able to apply them, if you can't decode, and that's a 0, even if you know what the word meant, 0 times 1 is still 0. So we have to address both of them. We have to make sure that students of all ages can decode the words of any complexity, and we have to make sure that they have the verbal comprehension skills to understand what those words mean and then to apply them in text. So that's really how reading works and what we want to focus on. There are some things, though, that are good indicators when a student is struggling. One of the ways we identify if they're going to need support or even additional support is if they have some of these characteristics. So for example, and this can sometimes extend all the way back to when they were in kindergarten or first grade. So did they have difficulty sounding out new and unfamiliar words and guess or skip when they're not sure? We see that in older grades as well. Do they have difficulty with spelling? Because as we mentioned, that's harder to spell something because you've got to have that spelling pattern in your mind to be able to do it accurately on paper. Does the student understand more when information is read to them as opposed to when they read it themselves? And a lot of times parents will know that because they ask, your child may say, can you read that to me? Or you'll notice that they understand it better when you read it. When a student does read out loud, does their reading sound slow and choppy? That can be an indicator. Do they reverse letters like B and D when reading and writing, or sometimes they mix up words that are similar like were and where? We see that even in adults. And then in their education classes, do they often need the support for reading, writing, and completing work on time? So that could be they're asked to write a paragraph, or they're taking a quiz or something like that where they have to write and they have a really, really difficult time completing that on time. So we would love to take questions. If you have questions about those kinds of things, we'll definitely have time at the end to kind of review that. So I want to talk a little bit about Elevate and how Elevate addresses those issues and what the plan is to help students who are at any level of reading difficulty become more proficient readers. So this is basically how it works in English. We have to ensure that students have sounds. So we have to start at the beginning with letter instruction, letter sounds. That doesn't mean we have to teach older students those, because generally they know them. But a lot of times they will have some gaps. And so you can see on the left, we teach in a way that's very explicit and multisensory. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on that if students don't need it, but we are going to make sure that students do have an understanding of those really basic foundational skills, because especially in upper grades, a lot of times they don't have them and nobody ever went back and checked or made sure that we closed those gaps. We use a marking system instead of using a lot of terms. So sometimes parents have heard these words, sometimes they haven't. Often teachers will talk about CVC words, and that just means a word with a consonant, vowel, consonant, or they'll talk about open and closed syllables, which are types of syllable patterns. We don't use those terms. What we use is a marking system that allows the brain to see the pattern first, and then we take the marking away. So you can see we start at the very beginning with letters and sounds, and then we move all the way into multisyllabic words, because that's where all of our students have to be. And we're going to do that systematically and move as quickly as the students can gain proficiency there. So it's very much what we're doing with this marking system, like the arrow in the FedEx logo. And I didn't know there was an arrow in the FedEx logo until I saw it. And now I can't unsee it. So whenever I see a FedEx logo on a truck or a FedEx box, my eye just naturally kind of goes to that arrow, because the brain can't be aware of something it doesn't see or is made aware of. And so we want to do that with these patterns that, again, are very predictable in English. So in order to do that, the Reading Horizons Elevate, which is designed for older students, uses two primary methods. One is direct instruction, which means the teachers have gone through training, they have direct instruction materials, and they're actually working with students in the classroom. In addition, we offer instructional software, and that is really helpful because it customizes every student's software instruction to what they need. So most of the students will take what's called a diagnostic assessment at the beginning, and that'll kind of tell us where their gaps are. But more importantly, it'll allow the software to address needs where they have, or skills where they have greater needs, and get more instruction and move much more quickly through skills that they don't really need a lot of instruction in. And that's designed to be done in a year or less. So our goal is to get students through the program as quickly as they can handle it and apply it to that text. So having both, having software and direct instruction, allows teachers to have more flexibility and allows students to gain progress much more quickly. So I'm going to just focus on kind of the building blocks of English that we call the 5 and 2, and then we're going to do a little activity. So I didn't know this when I first started teaching, that when we're trying to figure out if a vowel is long or short, and that's often a big difficulty. Students are not sure, and sometimes the adults are not sure. How do you know if a vowel is short or long? Well, there are 5 patterns in single syllable words with the short words that tell us if a vowel is short or long. And they are by far the most common patterns students will ever see. And we're going to show you how to move from those 5 patterns into multisyllabic words, when words have more than one syllable. And we're just going to apply this very visual process to doing that. The first thing that we have to know, and students have to know, is that every syllable can only have one vowel or vowel sound. That's important. And second, what happens after the vowel is what determines whether the vowel is short or long. I didn't know that. So you'll see we're going to go through this process. I'm going to go through it relatively quickly, and then I'm going to have you do an activity to see how well I taught it. So we call these the 5 phonetic skills. And the first phonetic skill is really simple. It's just that consonant, vowel, consonant pattern. But what students start doing right from the beginning is identifying the vowel. So they go underneath and find the vowel, because vowels are so important. And we know every syllable can only have one sound, one vowel sound. Then we look to see what follows the vowel. And in this case, we see there's one consonant, T, following the vowel, and we're going to mark that with a star. We call that a guardian star because one consonant after a vowel always makes the vowel short. So you can see this is very simple. I don't have to label it or call it anything. When we look at a word, we see one consonant after the vowel makes the vowel short. Very simple. Phonetic skill 2 is just like it. We're going to go underneath first and find our vowel and go, now we go up and around the back of the word to see what follows the vowel. We see the P first, then the M. Two consonants after the vowel in a word also make the vowel short. And these are the only two patterns that create the short sound in English. And they're so common. So remember, one consonant after the vowel or two consonants after the vowel's going to be short. So when we get to this pattern and we find our vowel, we see there is no consonant after the vowel. So this vowel is what we call stands alone. When there is no guardian consonant guarding that short vowel sound, the vowel is going to be long. So when students have learned those three simple patterns, this translates easily into those longer, more than one syllable words, because by the time students have learned these three simple patterns, they make up over 70% of the most common syllable types when they get to these bigger, longer words. So you're going to see that in just a moment. So when there's no consonant after the vowel and the vowel stands alone, it's long. This word is a new pattern because we have more than one vowel, and this can be really tricky for students, but I'm going to show you how to make it very easy. So again, we're going to find our vowels, and this time we see there are two vowels, but the second one is E at the end of the word. In this pattern, E at the end of the word is always silent. It has to be because we can only have one vowel sound. And if the E weren't there, that K would be a consonant and the vowel would be short. So silent E's only job is to make that first vowel long. And that is a very, very consistent pattern in English. So silent E makes the first vowel long. This one is a little tricky because again, we have two vowels, but this time they're next to each other. So we're going to mark those. But again, we can only have one vowel or vowel sound. So just like in the silent E pattern, it's the second vowel that's silent to make the first vowel long. The tricky part here is that does not apply to all vowel teams. There are 9 specific vowel teams that apply to this pattern, like AI and EA and OA, etc. So students have to know what those specific patterns are, right? So those are the 5 single syllable patterns that create a long or short vowel sound. So now we're going to do a little activity. I'm going to show you this little bookmark on the side. We're going to go over that again and you'll have a little reference. And then I've given you a word bank. So on your piece of paper, you will have 5 columns and you can label them however you want to. You could just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that will go along with these 5 syllable types right here. So number 1, remember that the one consonant after the vowel is going to make the vowel short. 2 consonants after the vowel will make the vowel short. Nothing after the vowel will make the vowel long. Silent E will make the first vowel long. And when you've got 2 vowels next to each other, the second vowel is silent to make the first vowel long. So what I want you to practice, just to try, is look at the words in the word bank below and see if you can figure out on your paper where those words would go. So look only at the pattern, where the vowels are and what follows the vowels, or in what pattern the vowels exist, and then see if you can match them to these 5 phonetic skills over here that are identified across the top. So I'm going to give you a couple minutes just to see if you can see the patterns, because again, this is a very visual process. And there's one of these that's a little tricky, so we'll see if you get that. And it can be tricky for students too, so. Okay. I'm just going to start, if you're still working on it, that's fine. I'm just going to start with 1. So can somebody unmute, or you can, I don't know if you can type in the chat or something like that. You can pick any one of those words and see if you can decide which column that would go in, which phonetic skill the word would apply to. You can pick any word. Anybody willing to give it a try? Or let me pick a word and see if you can figure out where it goes. So where do you think this word would go? Would it be, which pattern does it follow? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Anybody got a guess? Well, not a guess. Anybody figured out from the pattern? We don't have to guess.
I think for 4 is spoke.
Yep, phonetic skill 4. How do you know that?
Because I found the vowels and then the E on the end changes the other vowel to
Yep,
the long sound.
that's right.
Long vowel.
And you decoded the word. So what was the word?
Spoke.
Oh, right. So that silent E causes the first vowel to be long. Okay. What about this word? This is a little trickier. Anybody want to try this word, and then we'll talk about it for a second. This is probably the most challenging one. And I don't know, is there a chat function that you can just type something in a chat? Does anybody want to guess where, or anybody want to identify where this would go? I don't know why I keep saying guess. You don't have to guess. Well, the big question here is, what pattern do we see? And this one's tricky because there are 2 vowels next to each other, but there's actually 3 vowels in a row. The thing that students learn right away is that, oh, nice, Teresa. Pen goes in number 1. Perfect, because there's the 1 consonant after the vowel. Students learn right away that QU, when U is with Q, it is no longer a vowel. Q doesn't have a sound by itself, so we need U to create a sound. So it is not a vowel when it's with Q. So our 2 vowels are A and I next to each other. And where does anybody think that would go when you've got 2 vowels next to each other? Second one's silent, first one's long. Oh, Teresa is on fire. Number 3 is she. Okay. And 5 would be where quail would go. So again, the second vowel is silent to make that A say A. And then we've got the QU, quail, quail. Great. And I think pen we know is in 1. She is in 3 because the vowel stands alone. So where would this last word go? What do we see after the vowel? And which pattern does it follow? 2, blast. Excellent. Okay. That's essentially what is the foundation of single syllable patterns in English, those 5 skills. That's not to say that there's not a lot more to learn, but I will show you how that translates directly into what students need to know when they get into those longer, more complex words. And this is why this can be so confusing for students, because when we have that first pattern with just nothing after the vowel is long. But if you add a letter, like phonetic skill 1, then the vowel goes short. If you add a silent E, the vowel goes long again, and that can be really confusing. So when you get to a word like this, where E isn't at the end of the word anymore, what do we do? So that's where we get into multisyllabic words. And there's only 2 patterns in English that really account for the vast majority of words. And we call those decoding skills. And the first decoding skill is, again, we're going to find those vowels. And this time we see 2 vowels, and E is not at the end of the word. So we know it's going to be a sounded vowel. Every syllable has to have a vowel or vowel sound. So those 2 X's tell us this is a 2-syllable word. The big question for students is, what now? Now what do I do? So when we look between 2 vowels like this, if there's 1 consonant, that 1 consonant is going to go with the second syllable, and we're going to divide right in front of it. So 1 consonant moves to that next syllable, and we divide here. Now, doesn't this pattern look familiar? We have a vowel with nothing after it in that syllable, so that vowel is going to be long. We've got one consonant after the vowel, and that vowel is going to be short. And then we put those two syllables together, motel. So that's decoding skill 1. So, and you'll notice that in these examples, there is a long vowel. So the first syllable has a long vowel because we're splitting after the vowel. Decoding skill 2 is just like it. We go through and find our vowels. Again, we have 2 X's, tells us 2-syllable word. But now when we look between the two vowels, we see there are 2 consonants. And unless the 2 consonants are a blend or a digraph, which is something else students learn, they're going to split. And then this is usually really easy because we often see there's one consonant after the vowel. We know that's going to make the vowel short. Again, one consonant is going to make the vowel short, and the word is campus. So in decoding skill 1, the first vowel is almost always long. In decoding skill 2, the vowel in the first syllable is almost always short. So very simple for students to learn, but you can see that it does get more complex because we're going to go to 2 and 3 and 4-syllable words, and they have to know the things like what happens to the sound of C when it's followed by an E, for example. It changes to the sound of S. So they're learning those skills as they go along. So when they get to these bigger words, they will be able to, identify what to do. So we're going to try something in a nonsense word because you would already know how to spell a lot of words. So we're going to identify what's the first thing that we would do that will help us support our syllable division. We're going to find the vowels. So again, we have 2 vowels, and we know that this is a 2-syllable word. Now, when we look between the 2 vowels, what do we have? How do we know where to split this word based on the patterns we learned earlier? Anybody hazard a guess or just remember what we talked about? Where would we split this word into syllables?
Between M and P.
And between the 2 consonants, right? And when we do that, we again see in our first syllable, one consonant makes the vowel short, and there's nothing after the vowel in the second syllable, so the word is Strambo. And the way it's helpful to use nonsense words is many times when students come to an unknown word, it's like a nonsense word. So it's very helpful to make sure that they can apply those skills in words they might not already know. And then we just take those skills into, 3-syllable and 4-syllable words. So again, this is a longer word. I'm just going to show you how this would work. And students actually like this because it's a kind of a code. And they're marking up words first so that then their brain starts to recognize the pattern. And then we take the markings away, and then they're going to be in text, which of course doesn't have any markings. So we're going to find our vowels, vowel, 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 vowel. So this time we have 4 vowels, but E at the end of the word is going to be silent. So it leaves with this 3 syllables. And now we just apply the 2 decoding skills. So we look between the first 2 vowels, A and O. We see there are 2 consonants, so we're going to split them. And then there's the M is 1 consonant after that vowel. It's going to move to the next syllable. And then we just apply those single syllable patterns that students already knew to multisyllabic words. So that's how it works. So that's just a little bit about the process of moving from simple to more complex, but getting students into the skills they really need to be able to decode. So I now want to talk a little bit about text. So what's your reaction just from looking? I know you can't read it. You don't even have to read it. Just as an adult looking at this page, what's your reaction to looking at something like this? And I know at least some of you can use the chat. Feel free to unmute or just type it in the chat. What's your response to this? Too many words, okay? Anybody else? And then I want you to think about what that feels like for a student who maybe isn't to the point where they really have those more advanced comprehension skills and decoding skills to be able to understand what they're reading. So yes, this is math with all those words. And so one of the big challenges now is that we assess math through math word problems, which means sometimes we have the same difficulty because students have to be able to read and understand what they're reading. So we have the same challenges that we have in an English class, a math class, social studies, etc. What could be challenging for students who are trying to read a passage, a novel, something in their English language arts class? If they are struggling or a lot of text is overwhelming for them, you can see this could be very, very challenging. And then looking at, these performance tasks where we're asking them to do something that they have to read and reflect on. And sometimes there is just a lot of text on a page, and students can often just kind of shut down. Sometimes when they look at a page and they see that it's complex and there's so many words, they just kind of give up before they ever get started. So that's an issue that we want to address. And now I want to talk about comprehension, because that's really how we build better readers. So I want you to read this paragraph and see if you think you know what they're talking about. And if you do, don't put it in the chat yet. And then I'm going to ask you, what would you need in order to understand what this passage is talking about? To comprehend something, we have to know some things about the words. And what would we need to know about before we could understand this passage? Rose, I'll just ask you, since you're unmuted, what would you need to understand? Oh, okay. Teresa said what the abbreviations mean.
There's
Absolutely.
a lot of words I don't know, and there's some abbreviations that I'm also not familiar with, so I would need to know that.
Exactly. So Teresa said you need to know the vocabulary, obviously, and the acronyms and things like that. Yep. Does anybody? I'm sorry. Say that again. I think somebody said something. Okay, maybe not. So I don't know if anybody thinks they know what this is talking about. Anybody want to hazard a guess what this is talking about? Because what we also don't have, in addition to the words, is we don't have a context. We don't have some background knowledge that we might want. And so I'm just going to show you what this passage. Oh, good guess, Teresa. Okay, so we're going to go through this, and we're just going to really quickly give you this context and some help with understanding what they're talking about. So they were talking about ensuring their regulator. So you can see the regulator in scuba diving is what you breathe out of, and this is that BCD. That what they're doing is the giant stride, getting into the water from a boat or a dock, and then the C cards are the certification cards for diving. So if there's cave diving, night diving, wreck diving, different kinds of diving, you have to have a sort of a certification. And then two really important things when you're scuba diving is gauges, because they tell you how deep you are and how much air you have left in your tank. Both very important things to know when you're scuba diving. And then it talks about ATM or atmosphere levels. And so we know the deeper we go, the more pressure there is, and that's also important. So that's why you need to know how deep you are. So once you have information like that, now you can really go, oh, I can understand what they're trying to say in this passage. Without that, it's highly unlikely that most people would, if they've not scuba dived. So when we're talking to students about any topic, really, if it doesn't matter in history, if we're talking about the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, or any part of history, if we're talking about math, etc., that we need to know background knowledge and context. We have to know vocabulary. We have to be able to decode the words or get support for decoding them until we have those skills ourselves. We have to have some discussion, because a lot of times just reading the words, it works better if we can talk about those words. And I was just at Council Rock last week, actually, a week ago today, and going into classes and talking to students about what they were reading. And it was really helpful to be able to have those discussions that are oral before they get into text. And then some guided practice, working them through these skills and finding these patterns, etc. And then how is that relevant to what we're studying? All those things are, what we want to embed in lessons. It's not just about teaching kids how to read. It's how to take them all the way to those higher level skills. So to summarize all of that, if we want students to be proficient readers, we have to make sure that at any age or grade level that they have adequate decoding skills. So when you're in first or second grade, those decoding skills are, the complexity is not as great. But if you get into third grade and beyond, when the words get longer and more complex, and then into middle school and high school and things like that, they need adequate decoding skills at all levels, and they need to have practiced them and had lots of exposure in text. And if they need support, they need to get that support, because otherwise they just can't comprehend what they're reading. So we're going to focus a lot on helping students build those decoding skills. That's really where Rose and the district is focused, and then embedding those skills into every part of the curriculum, but particularly English language arts, which is where we have a lot of opportunity to talk about word patterns and spelling and things like that. So that's all I'm going to share tonight. What about discussion or questions?
I haven't seen anything in the chat yet, but if anyone wanted to unmute and share a question, we're happy to answer.
I'll just say that.
Thank you, Laura, for all.
And I'll just say, okay, I've heard of OG. Yes. So I'm glad that you've heard of OG, because a lot of parents have it. So OG stands for Orton Gillingham. You are really breaking up, Rose. You must have very limited connection, because we can not hear you very well. But put it in the chat, because we can definitely see that. So Teresa asked, what about OG and how does this program compare? So OG stands for Orton Gillingham. It is an approach that was developed actually quite a long time ago. So I don't know if you saw it on the slide earlier. We're essentially an OG program. We are based on the OG approach, which is that explicit, systematic, cumulative, diagnostic, multi-sensory way of teaching. So most of us have had OG training as well. And so when we work with teachers, more and more teachers are getting OG trained, which is great. But OG is the approach and the understanding of the science. It's not a curriculum. So in order to bring an OG approach into a classroom, you really need the, you really need the curriculum that supplies the OG approach. So every school that's, implementing the science of reading now in OG has some sort of curriculum. So that's a great question. Any other questions? Or anyone have concerns about their own child or something like that? Because a lot of times, parents are interested in sessions like this because they have concerns about their child or their grandchild or a child that they know, and they want to make sure their child is getting the most appropriate support. Yeah, so do teachers get any training? Yes, that's what I've been doing a lot of in Council Rock, and we've had other people go there as well. So generally that starts with multiple days of training, and then last week I was there to do modeling, going into classrooms with students in 7th and 8th grade and modeling. We recorded some of those so that all teachers could see them. There were teachers observing. And then we do coaching where we go into classrooms and watch a teacher teaching and then give them feedback and talk about how they can, strengthen any component of the program. And then because we have software, we get data there too, and that can be really useful because students can work at their own pace. While the teacher maybe is working with one group of students, the other group of students can be working at their own level, at their own pace, and then they can switch. And then again, always connecting those skills into text. That's the most important thing. Really just making sure we're applying those skills. What class? Oh, this is a great question for Rose. So you can kind of type that in. What classes are using the program? Right. So students who have demonstrated that they might need some additional support or need, skills building in this realm are in a literacy skills class. So that's 7th and 8th grade. And those were the classes I was in last Monday. And again, really bright kids that just need additional support with decoding and, you know, making that bridge into comprehending, you know, 7th and 8th grade text. Oh, yes, and important to note, we do have another program. This was about Elevate, which is for older students, but we have another program called Discovery, which is for students in kindergarten to 2nd grade, and that program is called Reading Horizons Discovery. So they're implementing that as well in Council Rock. Yes, and that's why they started implementing it in those early grades, so that we don't have as many students that end up in upper grades that are struggling. So absolutely, that is the key everywhere in the country. And that's really the shift, that we identify early and then we make sure students have the appropriate kinds of supports. Thanks for those questions. So yep, K to 6. Any other questions? What I hope you see is at least a little bit of tonight is that when we give students adequate information about how English works, about how words work, and how we connect those very consistent patterns to what they're doing, as well as the understanding that there's a lot of words that are not going to be English words, and we're going to have to support the pronunciation. So they were reading something in class last week called The Rogue Wave, and we needed to talk about the word rogue because that comes from French. So, you know, that pattern is different. The way we pronounce it is different. And just having that really interesting conversation about words and how they really make all the difference when we're trying to comprehend text. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. We recorded this as well. And if you have any other questions, please reach out to Rose. Yes, the teachers at Council Rock have been awesome to work with. I've been there, I think, 3 or 4 times now, and I know other people have as well. So we're very invested in supporting the district and the teachers as they're supporting their students. Yes. So do they assess reading levels?
Oh, sorry. I was going to jump in really quick. As a teacher, I apologize. You might hear my little one in the background here. But as a teacher, I wanted to jump in and say, you know, yes, we have done all the training and all, but honestly, I have to speak to the kids too, because they've really been so open to it. And as much as it's exciting to us to kind of see some of the phonetic rules or things that we didn't remember learning as a child, it's so interesting to see it in our 7th graders too. I mean, they're jumping right into things that, you know, in theory, they know or they remember, but they're learning it in a new way. And they're just so open to making those connections. So it's really interesting seeing this happen at the 7th grade level right now.
Yeah, it was really fun working with the students. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I know my internet is not great.